someone there. He said, well, did you go well? He said, well, it went okay, but I wish I'd asked for $200. And people are like that, aren't they? You give them one thing, and they wish you'd had more. And we're all a bit like that. But that wasn't the sort of contentment. This man was content with something which was lesser, something that was second rate, something that wasn't really in God's will for him. And then God surprised him. You'll remember the story of the bush that never burned, and how God appears in the fire of that bush. This is one of the greatest miracles of the Old Testament. And God speaks to him and reveals himself to him, and he calls him by name, and he tells him that he's going to send him back to Egypt to deliver his people. And Moses is fearful. And Moses is full of excuses. And you remember that there were 5 excuses that Moses made. And I want you just to notice them. In chapter 3 and verse 11, he says here, and Moses said unto God, who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? He's saying there that he's a nobody. Here's a man who was a prince of Egypt. Here was a man who had great position, great education, great learning. And he says, who am I? Here's a man with an inferiority complex. Look at verse 13. And Moses said unto God, behold, when I am come to the children of Israel, and say unto them, the God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, what is his name? What shall I say unto them? Isn't it amazing that this man, brought up by his mother, taught the things that we know he knew, and yet he can't remember the name of God? Here's a man not only with an inferiority complex, he's got a forgetful memory. And then we come to chapter 4 and verse 1. And Moses answered and said, but behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice. For they will say, the Lord hath not appeared unto him. They won't believe me. Suddenly he's full of all unbelief. And then we come to verse 10. And Moses said unto the Lord, my Lord, I'm not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. He can't speak. With all the education he'd had, with all the experience he'd gone through, here was a man who was claiming inadequacy. I can't speak. And then in verse 13, we'll see here again. And he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. Send somebody else. Here's what we call the transference of responsibility. Oh, I know someone ought to go. I know someone ought to do it. I can see what you mean, but send somebody else. You know, Joseph Parker, who was a contemporary of C.H. Spurgeon, said this: how inventive we are in finding excuses for not doing God's will. That's true, isn't it? C.H. Spurgeon himself said this: it is hard to overcome unbelief in the human heart. How difficult we seem to find it to trust and to venture upon the naked promise of God. We're all a bit like that. And tonight we come to this final service of this conference week. And I guess that there are many people here who've heard the Lord speak in one way or another, maybe for salvation, maybe for service, maybe about something in their own lives. And somehow we've been very inventive in our excuses. Why we won't do the will of the Lord. Why we won't go. Why we won't do. Why we won't give up. Whatever it may be, we're very inventive, aren't we? But look how God answered him. First of all, he shows his presence. In verse 12 he says, and he said, certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee, that I have sent thee. You know, if God should say to you tonight, go, and you say, but listen, I'm not sure as I could go. But God said clearly to you, certainly, that's the positive note, I will be with thee. Don't you think you'd say, I'll go? If I know God's going to be with me, I'll go, but not Moses. And so God has to speak to him again. And in verse 13, God says, and God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, thou shalt say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent you, the all-sufficient God. I am. There's nothing outside of that. God is everything. I am has sent you. And then in verse 12, of course, there's another promise there where it says, I will be with you. And now we come to verse 14 of chapter 4, where it says, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well. And also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. And when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. You know that Aaron became his spokesman. This was second best. And in this sense, Moses had second best because he argued with God. Wouldn't it be tragic if there's a young person here, or even an older person, doesn't matter who you are, and yet, after all this week and all these messages and the challenge that we have received, and yet we go from this place and we accept second best instead of God's best for our lives. Let me tell you, when you get old, you look back upon your life and you say, I wish I'd done that, I wish I'd done that, and I wish I'd done this. Listen, you shouldn't live with regret, should you? But some of you will live with regrets if you accept second best and are not prepared for God's best in your own heart and in your own life. But what I want to say tonight is how God spoke to Moses. Because here was Moses before him, and Moses says, but they won't believe me. They won't take any notice of me. Who am I? And then God says, and the Lord said unto him, what is that in thine hand? And he said, a rod. You know, there are many lessons that we can learn from that particular verse. And I want to go through some of them tonight with you, but look at this first of all. The first lesson that you see here is God doesn't see as man sees. There's almost a surprise here. God says to Moses, what is that in thine hand? And Moses said, well, this, it's a rod. God sees differently. And tonight we could look at you and we could say lots and different things about you maybe, but God looks at you in a different way. And then the second thing, obviously, that we see here is this, that God can take the ordinary and make it special. Don't we say something sometimes, little is big when God is in it? Are you a little person? You feel insufficient? You're not as good as them? Educationally, you're not really up to what they are? And anyway, you just blend in the background. You're not a leader. You're not a person that goes to the front. Listen, little is big when God is in it. And the third thing that you can see here as well, and this is very important, God can use anybody and anything. Because the God that we believe in is the sovereign God of heaven. And if he is the sovereign God of heaven, he made all things. And we believe that he can use anybody and anything. I came across a poem recently. You might know this. If God can hang the stars on high, can paint the clouds that drift on by, can send the sun across the sky, what could he do through you? If he can send a storm through space and dot the trees, the mountain face, If he, the sparrow's way can trace, what could he do through you? If God can do such